Welcome to the Science of Grief. I am your host, Natasha T. Miller. This is our fourth annual Science of Grief, a program that we started in 2018 in Detroit in partnership with the Detroit Institute of Arts. And we are really thrilled to be bringing this program to the Michigan State University's campus in partnership with WKAR and Michigan State Museum's Science Gallery. I am the Community Engagement Manager at Science Gallery, what was Science Gallery Detroit, but again, what is now Michigan State Museum's Science Gallery. So the program this year is Fall into Grief, Spring into Wellness. Over the past few years, we have spent a lot of time focusing on the grief, and that being the science of grief. And now we know, after we've all been pandemic-stricken for so long, that we now want to focus on how we can better take care of ourselves, how we can better try to heal ourselves and others through community. The science of grief, we like to explore it and explain it as a community conversation on grief. And we explore grief through the lens of art, science, poetry, and other mediums. So today we have our keynote speaker, who I will not welcome up right now, but for you who are on the live stream, we're all very excited for Dr. LeConté Dill delivering a conversation and a keynote on wellness. So again, I am Natasha T. Miller. We will take just a few minutes to allow a lot of people, because a lot of you are not here right now, but to allow people to actually come into the space. And this first hour is dedicated to people being able to talk about the grief that they've experienced, not only through the pandemic, but some grief that they've experienced over the course of their lives. If we have people come in and speak in the next few minutes, it would be a journey for us all. And if not, then I will come up and also give you another backstory about how the science of grief came to be. So stick around for the next 5 to 10 minutes. We will play a little music in the background. Go take your bathroom break, go get your evening drink, your evening coffee, your evening wine, whatever it is that you do, and I will be right back as your host. Welcome back to the Science of Grief 2022. Thank you all who are on the live stream for sticking around and for joining this conversation today, which again is us bringing into wellness together. As the host and one of the main producers of the Science of Grief, I think that it is important that I tell you how the Science of Grief came to be. So the Science of Grief was a very personal program that I decided to create based off of something that affected me very deeply and very personally. And it came from, or the thing that affected me was losing my brother Marcus in 2013. So I like to start the story as my brother and I were 1 year and 11 days apart. And we shared the same mother, and we shared the same father. So you can only imagine how closely we grew up. I like to say that he was and still is my best friend in so many ways. And as we have this conversation on grief, and as we've had this conversation on grief in many different ways through my career at Michigan State and the Science Gallery, we like for people to, one, understand that grief is not a linear process. It is very messy. So for me to be able to arrive at the point of even producing a program that speaks my brother's name back into existence, it was not the starting point. And then again, when I talk about the best friendship with my brother, we had many types of relationships over the years. And as I grow and as the passing of him becomes, I would say, more distant and more distant, I still try to speak him back into existence and throw programs that allows me to remember him and to remember how present he has always been in my life. So my brother, Marcus, was murdered December 28th, 2013. just a few days before New Year's and just a few days before my birthday. My brother has a son, and my nephew, who I've had the pleasure of being able to take the reins on raising for the last few years. But I like to tell people I remember the moment that I was in bed with my nephew watching the Beast of the Southern Wild, which is a movie that I've grown to love for many reasons. But in the middle of us watching this movie, I think I get the phone call that nobody in their life wants to get, especially not as a little sister, which is people telling me that he's gone, he's dead. And I didn't have to ask who, because I think I already knew that they were speaking about my brother for a multitude of reasons. And I think that death is one of those things that we all try to prepare ourselves for. But when it happens, you realize that there is no preparation for you losing the person that you love or a person that you care about, and especially not the person that you considered to be one of your best friends and thought that you would grow old together, you would watch each other get married, or in my case, probably never get married, but you will watch all of these different moments that for each other that we'd be able to share. So I get the call December 28th, and immediately I'm thrown into this position where I have to not only grieve the death of my brother, but I also have to go into this mode of planning a funeral for this person that I never wanted or never thought I would be able to accept passing away before I thought he should have been passing away. So my birthday is December 3rd. And my brother was actually cremated on my birthday, which was another pivotal moment for me. I remember in the middle of the day, even after I made the decision to get my brother cremated because of personal conversations that him and I had, I remember the middle of the day calling the funeral home to try to get them to not cremate my brother, and it was already too late. They said we're already in the middle of doing this thing. And then the day after my birthday, it was my brother's funeral, which was very difficult for me. And then a few days later, we fast forward, and now it's my brother's, what would have been his 30th birthday. So every year, around the holidays, I am reminded of this very traumatic thing that happened to me. But for the first 2 years after my brother passed away, I had a very, very close circle of friends and family members who I felt like were always there for me. If I needed to call them in the middle of the night, if I needed to call them early morning, if I needed to go out and just like breathe with them, I had this community of people who were very present. And at some point, I realized that I didn't want to put the burden, or at least what I thought was a burden, on the same people. So I stopped calling them and I stopped talking to them. I just kind of went into my own shell. And then while I was in this shell, I realized that I had no idea what grief was. I had no idea what it was that was happening to me emotionally, that was happening to me mentally, and that was happening to me physically. And one night I'm just awake in bed and I say it's like 4 a.m. And I think to myself, wow, I'm really sad 3 years into my brother's death. Who do I call? And I could have picked up the phone and I could have called anybody, but I decided I don't want to call anybody because, again, I don't want to be a burden to these people who have been there and been so present in my life. And then I also realized that there's other people dealing with grief. I am not the only person stricken with this thing. I am not the only person who lost her brother. I know there's people who've lost their brother, who's lost their mother, who's lost, their friend, their boyfriends, whoever it was in their lives. So it wasn't just me. And from that came this idea of what if I created a community where we held space for people to just come and get on stage and just tell the story of the grief that they were experiencing over the person or the thing that they lost. And it was a very crazy idea because it was a 24-hour program that I wanted to throw, and everybody was like, this is madness. And I went to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and it went from 24 hours to 14 hours. And we ran this 14-hour program for at least 3 years in Detroit before the pandemic happened. And people would come from 9 p.m. until 7 a.m. and just get on stage and just tell stories about the people that they lost and speak these people back into existence, but also just acknowledge the grief that they were experiencing. And we would provide resources for them to be able to navigate that grief long after the science of grief has ended. That is the way in which, or at least one of the ways in which I was able to deal with the grief of losing my brother. And we look forward to this program every year, not just me, because it gives me space year after year to see how my grief has transitioned, to see how I am in more than likely a better space than I was the year before. But again, grief is very messy. Sometimes I'm not in a better space, and that also provides some sort of recognition for me to be able to understand what should come next in my life. So the science of grief is very personal. It is very personal. We're very grateful to have you all on the live stream. We're very grateful to see that we have evolved the conversation from grief now into wellness. And again, how do we take care of ourselves? So we are grateful for our keynote speaker. And before we take a break, which is going to be a very short break, and bring our keynote speaker up to talk about how we all want to spring into wellness together, I took you on a short journey about my relationship with my brother and my relationship to grief. And I think it is probably only right that I read a few poems out of my latest book, which is Butcher. And this whole book is pretty much dedicated to the grief that I experienced after losing my brother. So when I talk about all of those people being there for you, and one of the reasons that I decided to create Science of Grief is because once those people go home and they go back to work and they go back out of town and the funeral has already happened, you start to realize that you actually lost somebody, and in that moment where you got to congregate with the people that you love and hug the people that you love and share food with the people that you love, you now feel like you have to face the grief that you are actually experiencing. So out of Butcher, this is one of the first poems that I wrote after I realized that I was actually grieving. The day after the dead dies, it's a family reunion. The day after the dead is buried, it's a death. And you have to go to work tomorrow, because bereavement days last the same amount of time, whether you just buried your dog or your only brother or buried them right next to each other, and you have to iron your clothes now. When they can no longer see your wounds, they expect for you to look better. The obituary is already wrinkled. You start to feel like you should be straightened out now. It's not like he just died yesterday. It's not like people are still calling to see if you are okay. You should be able to rest now. You're not dreaming about him anymore, because even the dead can feel when they are old news, when their sons have stopped asking, when they are coming back, when the rest in peace t-shirts are too faded to remember who you were actually remembering. Who were you remembering? How long has it been since their profile became just another picture at the bottom of a police file, since their dirty clothes at the bottom of your hamper stopped smelling like all the trouble that you tried to pray them away from? How long has it been since your friends stopped by the house with flowers for your mother, listened to you repeat the same stories, laughed and engaged as if it was the first time they've heard this name in years? How long has it been? How many days does it take for a death to stop feeling like a family reunion, for you to feel alone like an only child, like you've lost something you love and you could feel it now? Thank you. So that is a family reunion, one of the first poems out of the book. And I do want to keep reminding people, or just allow people to understand, that I am no expert on grief. I am just a person that dealt with grief and decided to find ways to have a larger conversation about it. I would say that Dr. LeConté Dill is an expert as a doctor. I'm just a person. But as you're looking at this on the live stream, we know that there are a lot of different emotions that you will probably go through and have to process. And if at any time this conversation feels too heavy for you, we encourage you to take a break from the conversation, to gather yourself or get whatever it is that you need to remain healthy, to remain sane, to remain in a safe space while listening to a conversation, because grief is not easy to endure and it is not easy to speak about. And once again, we are grateful for our partners at WKAR and the Michigan State University Museum. And if you contact us after this program, there is a resource list that we can provide to you so that you can know what help is out there for you if you are experiencing grief as well. So I will do a poem that I wrote dedicated to my brother. I always say when I tell the story that cremation it's a large part of the grief that I was experiencing. When I talk about being a little sister and trying to figure out how to keep her mother safe and bury her older brother and do everything right, sometimes you think that you've gotten everything wrong. You know, I never planned a funeral before my brother passed away, and then I stepped into this role and I tried to plan this funeral while simultaneously being the saddest that I had ever been in my life. And I felt like there were some things that I did along the way. And now that I reflect on it, I know that the decisions that I made were out of love, and I did the best that I could do with what I had. So this is to anybody experiencing any feelings after losing somebody about how they handled the loss, and it's called hot flashes. When the oven at your mother's house goes out, a day after your brother passes away, you don't see it as a sign. You don't curse the stove or call the electric company because you're too busy dealing with the shock of his death. 1, when my brother was 5, he burned his leg with a hot iron up until his cremation. The mark was so fresh on his skin that you would have thought he spent every morning trying to straighten himself out too. My brother pushed me into a space heater and bent the legs on it 4 months before he passed away. Every day that I walked past that heater was a reminder to hold my grudge and not speak to him until he apologized. 3, the unfortunate thing about reminders is that they're mostly rooted in the past and tend to ignore our current realities. My brother probably died believing that I hated him when the left side of the space heater goes out 2 days after your brother passes away. You don't see it as a sign. You don't curse the space heater or call the manufacturer because you're too busy dealing with the shock of his death. 4, my mother never forgave herself for leaving that iron plugged in. 5, you can blame anything on the dead, so it is easier to say out loud cremation is what they would have wanted when you were really just thinking about how much money you'll save, not paying for a casket almost every night for the first 2.5 years after my brother's funeral. I would mysteriously break out into hot flashes, proof that the dead can hold their grudge much longer than the living. 6, I'll probably never forgive myself for getting my brother cremated, which confirms that I am more like my mother than I want to admit. When you have to confirm with the funeral home that you still choose the option to cremate 5 days after your brother is murdered, you stand outside of your mother's home, you ask your brother to send a sign if he does not want to be cremated. A flock of birds that weren't there before all leave the rooftop and fly in the same direction of the sky. You don't see it as a sign. You don't curse the clouds or even change your mind because you're too busy frozen in the shock of his death. Thank you. So I am going to step into the last poem of my book, which I think is the first poem that brought us to the Science of Grief. Again, the Science of Grief is an annual program that we have decided to program in different ways with different partnerships. We've had a 3-day festival, today being the second day, featuring Dr. LeConté Dill as our keynote speaker. Last night we were with Lauren Russell, where we led a workshop in partnership with the Broad Museum, where we took Frida Kahlo's medical records and had people bring their medical records and find a way to center themselves and their humanness in the data. And tomorrow, we actually get to end the Science of Grief with a conversation between Sundari and Bonnie Wheeler, who was a CAPS counselor at Michigan State for almost 30 years, who's retired now. And then following the conversation about grief, we actually have a meditation session, which should pair very well with what we'll hear today about how we actually need to heal ourselves, take care of ourselves, and spring into wellness. Aside from you visiting the Michigan State Museum, I'm sure that WKR has a bunch of programs coming our way as well, but come and see us, come and check out any of the websites, and make sure that if you need that resource list, those resources are available to you on campus and in the East Lansing community. So this is the poem that brought me to the Science of Grief, which is how long it took me to realize that I was grieving and the damage I realized that I may have caused myself and others by not realizing that they were grieving as well. I learned that grief will humble you, that there's not enough success in the world to make you forget that your loved ones are gone. I've been terrible to all of my friends since my brother died. There's a person in Detroit that I hadn't talked to in 3 years prior to the night that he was killed, and she still showed up to the crime scene before his body was even removed from the concrete. She drank her liver into the darkest of holes and listened to the song Drunk in Love with Me for like 56 days straight, and the first time I felt well enough to go outside sober and sleep in the dark alone again, I stopped answering her calls. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. Even though there's a really good excuse, I know sometimes we become the hunted and the hunter, the monsters that we are running from and the monster that we are all becoming. I know that your phone has been ringing nonstop since your overdose, since your mother passed, since your relapse, since your lover left, since the very moment it happened, and you've been hitting the ignore button and telling yourself that nobody cares about you. And I get it. Grief is so much more contagious than joy. It seems easier to hand our baggage to people we love than move through the world freely. It's the reason I left my mother at home to mourn the death of her only son alone while I went on the road to perform poems for strangers, because hurt people is so cliche but true. So you blame anything on your pain. You become the excuse and the excuse, the burning building and the fire, expecting to be rescued while left alone until you are left alone, until you can no longer blame your behavior on your pain, until you have to be good to your friends again. And you send apologies years too late until you hear someone you love for the first time say that they can't forgive you. And you feel success and emptiness in the same body until you are humbled, until you realize that you are not the only one. We are all hurting, and as a result, hurting each other, until you learn to be grieving and gracious, until you learn that this was never just about you. Thank you. So before we take, I would say just a 5 to 10 minute break for everybody who's online right now, we do want to say that a part of this year's Science of Grief was acknowledging the trauma that the pandemic has caused all of us. And we think that it's very important that you at home acknowledge that something real has happened to you, and something real is still happening to us all. So we want to make sure that you always make sure to take care of your health and take care of your mental health as well. Like, please take care of yourselves. Understand that these programs are not to remind you of the thing that you have experienced, but to give you something to look forward to. So we will play some music for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and we will get ready for our keynote speaker, who again is going to give us a talk about how we can all spring into wellness together. Thank you. I am Natasha T. Miller. Welcome back to the Science of Grief 2022. Again, for those of you who have joined us in person and virtually, we are very excited to have you with us, and we are very grateful for our partners here at WKAR and the Michigan State University Museum. So right now, we are going to hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. LeConté Dill. Dr. LeConté Dill is an associate professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University. In her work as a community accountable scholar, educator, and poet, she listens to and shows up for urban Black girls and works to rigorously document their experiences of safety, resilience, resistance, and wellness. If you are at home and you would like to give a big round of applause, please give it up for our keynote speaker, Dr. LeConté Dill.
Good evening and hello. Thank you, Natasha, for that warm introduction. Thank you for this invitation to be part of the conversation around the science of grief. I am new to MSU. I came here in the fall, again, as Natasha said, in the Department of African American and African Studies, or AAAS, as we say here at MSU. And even though I've been here just a short time, I've been able to build with folks like Natasha already, been contacted with other folks at WKAR, people in the Center for Poetry, and others around MSU that have been so gracious around collaboration. And that brings me to this conversation today. Fall into grief, spring into wellness. And with that title, it is not meant to be that there's one season for grief. Grief only happens when it's cold or dark, fall and winter, and now it's spring and everything should be joyful and sunny. That's not what I mean. I mean that I want us to think about the evolution, the ongoing nature of both grief and wellness. They're in conversation with each other. They're cousins, if you will. And so I'm going to give some time and attention to talk about both grief and wellness. So I like to start my conversations where some folks end theirs with contact information. I'm only going to talk to you for about 45 minutes or so, I think. That's only a brief conversation, so we should continue the dialogue. For those that are tuning in with the live stream, we don't have a chat function. It's not like Zoom, so we won't be able to see questions, engage with your questions, but I do invite you to have questions, to write down your insights, and feel free to contact me. My email here at MSU, check out my personal and professional website, find me at Twitter, at DocDill, so that we can continue to have these conversations, because conversations is a big part of it, right? That's why we've had this 3-day celebration, if you will, this 3-day incubation, if you will, to unpack, to talk, to dialogue, to process grief, but also wellness. So since I've been at MSU, I've had the opportunity to explore some tools of wellness. And what I will be playing with and what I invite you to play, if you will, with are poetics and poetry, mindfulness and meditation, and somatics, movement, embodiment. So I will be using these tools, these technologies throughout my conversation today, and invite you to reflect or use these tools as well. Fall into grief, or perhaps melt into grief. This picture is my friend, my comrade, one of my teachers, Jasmine Hearn, who was a dancer, originally from Houston, Texas, done work all across the country, all across the world. I had a pleasure of taking a dance class with her in 2018 called Melt. And with Melt, with that technology, again, of movement, she encouraged the participants, the students, to consider how movement can be used to think about ancestry, which includes a little bit of grief and wellness, right? Use movement to think about lineage, to think about trauma, to think about health, to think about healing, right? And even in the picture before you, for those of you looking at the images, she's melting with this movement. So when Natasha spoke in the segment just before I came on, she shared that she's not an expert, that I'm the expert because I'm Dr. Dill. And while, yes, I have 3 advanced degrees, I've spent a lot of time studying, teaching, learning, relearning. I would say that Natasha is an expert and that we find expertise in and outside of academic spaces. And particularly Black feminisms remind us that experts are knowers in many spaces, knowers that produce knowledge in community, campus spaces, and then the liminal spaces in between. So yes, I actually have learned grief from Natasha and other writers. I'm trained in public health, but public health, we actually are not taught about grief. Public health is on everyone's lexicon now because of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, some people might have not known about the field of public health if they were not trained in it. And that's because parts of public health were working. We didn't really know about it because it was working, doing the things that we need to be well, to be safe, to be healthy. But also in crisis, we get to learn a little bit about public health, right? So as a public health trained scholar and practitioner, I actually was not taught about grief, about practices, about healing or comforting the bereaved. I've looked to Black feminisms, Black women, writers, authors, poets, memoirists, essayists, fiction writers who have been steeped in the knowledge production around grief. So Natasha's book, which she shared from in the segment right before this, Butcher, is a great text around grief. I had the pleasure of teaching her text this semester to my MSU undergraduate students in the Writing for Our Lives class. We read the book, we invited Natasha into our classroom space, we unpacked not just the amazing poetic forms, but also the hard, heavy stories of grief and the ongoing processes. I've looked to other Black women writers to tell me about grief, about the theories, about the practices, about the knowledges. Bell Hooks, before she became our ancestor, was not only writing literary criticism, was not only in speaking engagements, she's also a poet and a children's author, right? And we need to not forget the multitudes that she brings. She wrote so many poems around the elegy. The elegy is a poetic form that is all about honoring the dead, the lost. I've often said that Beloved by Toni Morrison is a trauma and recovery novel. So again, grief and wellness in conversation, trauma, recovery in conversation. Sonia Sanchez's book, Does Your House Have Lions? Not a lot of people talk about this book. I've had the pleasure of also teaching from this book, where she grapples with the death also of her brother and grapples with the nuances and complications that happen in families when death occurs. Those silences that were there even before death, the silences after death. In the book, she's in conversation with her brother as ancestor, in conversation with her father as estranged, in conversation with herself. And so again, looking to Black literature, Black women's literature, for understanding grief. Bitch is the New Black by Helena Andrews, a memoir, has one chapter where she delves into the loss, the death of her line sister who completed suicide. And I've also taught that chapter for students, health students, again, who typically are not trained in thinking about grief, to read literal memoir about how does her line sister, who everyone thought had it all together, went to Ivy League institution, had the great job in Washington, D.C., had the condo, had the car, and completed suicide, right? And so looking at the memoir is not just the loss, but the life, and then also thinking about the communities that remain. So I started out with saying that I was not an expert in grief, that I was looking to these other experts of grief, but with the invitation to think about the science of grief, I am realizing that I have some expertise. So this is a picture of me from 2019 in a hospital, wearing a hospital gown, wearing a hospital bonnet, so not the sleep bonnet that some of us know about, but the hospital bonnet that they make you wear. And with what I'm going to share next, I am learning about grief, I am processing grief, I am building my own knowledge and knowledge production around grief. This first poem is a contrapunto poem, and so for those of you that don't know or don't remember, there's multiple poems on the page that are going to be in conversation with each other. So I'm going to share what seems as one poem 3 times and evoke 3 different conversations. Taking a risk. On the day after my birthday, found out I was pregnant. The doctors were cautiously optimistic because of my levels. Said, congratulations. Said to come back in 2 days. Taking a risk. The day after is when I learned or that I heard that no longer could I celebrate. This month, not sure, talking in hushed tones because of my age, said they were sorry, said I could try again, but I would start bleeding. Taking a risk. On the day after my birthday is when I learned or found out that I heard that I was no longer pregnant. Could I celebrate this month? The doctors were not sure, cautiously optimistic, talking in hushed tones because of my levels, because of my age, said congratulations, said they were sorry, said to come back, said I could try again, but in 2 days, I would start bleeding. And on that bleeding, finding a rhythm. Scared of the blood, scarred from the blood, tired of the blood, made from the blood, marred from the blood, wade in the blood, wake from the blood, run from the blood, wring out the blood, ache from the blood, clean up the blood, give up the blood, gave up the blood, saved by the blood, named by the blood, cursed from the blood, mess of the blood, most of the blood, soak up the blood, soaked in the blood, woke up to blood, woke up with blood, woke up in blood, woke up in blood, woke up in blood. Taking a break. It is hard to write from the echo in your chest, to resuscitate again and again. It is damn hard to get yourself out. of a gulf. When I think about my own grief, this loss that happened actually twice in 2019, back to back, in processing the grief, in understanding the grief, and even naming it as grief, which didn't happen immediately, I, again, go look at Black women. This time I'm not looking necessarily at the shelves in my office, my bookshelf. I'm looking at the shelves of my family lineage, of my memory. So this is a picture of my mother before I knew her. She's tuning in on the live stream. She knows I'm gonna share some hard poems, but with grief and wellness, it's complicated, so I'm also gonna share some lighter poems to, again, unpack the nuance. But in thinking about looking at a younger version of my mother, so much that I've learned about grief, but also about wellness, is about the spaces that she's opened up for me to unpack those things as a scholar and a poet. And she opened up those spaces not by being a scholar or a poet herself, but literally about creating space. We say create space a lot in writing spaces, in academic spaces, but for her, creating space for me to unpack, to learn, to heal, was literally creating a desk out of a box, giving a pencil or a crayon first tools of writing, finding art galleries, finding Black bookstores, finding speaking engagements. So in addition to the homage that I thank her for creating for me, I also want to attend to the own grief that she experienced long before I know her. And the other characters in this next poem, the grief that they were experiencing that I also didn't see, because there was some healing, and even if healing is created through silence or through distance. Content warning, there will be a lot of mention about domestic violence. Finding an origin. Your daddy almost starved your mama to death, and your brother, and your sister, and you, tucked away in the inside. Your daddy almost beat your mama to death. Such a tired skipping record. A man beating his lady. A wonder he didn't beat you out. You came into this world almost tearing your mama apart, almost 10 pounds of you, and they called you greedy. I'd like to think you were hungry from being starved all those days, from surviving on just your mama's love. She said you had big old eyes, taking in the world around you, no longer in the dark. No more knocking upside your head. You've told me this story 1,000 times. I hear it different now. As I run back 60, 70, 80, 90, 100,000 years before the beating and the breaking, before the first breaths. So I mentioned my mama's mama in that poem. We're going to give her some space to breathe, to be in this space, to grieve, to heal. I called her Nana Susie, Susie Layton, later Susie Sterling. My mother, Deborah Sterling, called their names, cite Black women, knowers, doers, scholars, again, inside and outside of classroom spaces. So Susie Sterling grew up in southern Arkansas. She came to Los Angeles, California in the 1940s, part of the national movement of the Great Migration, the second wave of the Great Migration. She came to Los Angeles, I think on Railroad, when she was in her early 20s. So I think about the 1940s and a Black girl, child, woman traveling from the South to the West, thousands of miles, as an early 20-year-old, right? But I'm gonna share a little bit about her journey before and her journey after. Sun sets west. Miss my mama, never knew her. Miss my daddy, couldn't keep us, couldn't keep with us. Granny kept us. Miss her so, I changed my name to hers. Myrtle say, stop all that missing talk. Fast forward. It's the 6 of us now. They're building new projects over on Imperial Avenue Highway, but I've saved up enough to put down on a house. Jack say that's too far from his mama. He don't know far. On a Sunday after church, he in a good mood. We ride by the beach. I roll down my window, let the wind on my face. Still, I know that sand, not dirt. Ocean, not river. Sun, not scorching. Not daylight for long. So when my Nana Susie left Canfield, she pretty much did not go back. She might have gone back for one funeral, but unlike some of my other relatives that were part of the Great Migration who talked about the home places in the South or the family reunions I even partook of going back to the family land in the South, Nana Susie did not claim that space in Southern Arkansas because of the grief, because of the painful memories. And that kind of not claiming and sometimes not talking about and not remembering, Toni Morrison calls this a rememory. Professor Cynthia Dillard also talks about rememory. So those are the memories that are tucked back so far and not revealed, not shared, not talked about because they are too painful. So for Nana Susie, life in Canfield, some of her earliest griefs of being kind of an orphan. That's a complicated term, particularly for Black folks. Her mama died when she was about 2. Her daddy gathered all the kids and dropped them off at their maternal grandmother's house. She was raised by her maternal grandmother and grandfather, so not orphan. Kinship care is what we talk about, right? Her grandparents did pass away by the time she reached adulthood, though, right? And so lots of grief at a young age. Hard to unpack. Miss my mama, never knew her, right? That rememory. As her lineage, I inherited some of the grief, some of the healing, but I'm also inherited, I feel like I have a charge to do some digging in those memories. They weren't all my personal memories, but I felt a charge or a calling to go back and get. What do we call that, right, in the Black diaspora? That Sankofa bird, go back to bring forth. And so in 2018, I found myself traveling to Southern Arkansas. Never been to that part, went by myself. No family members went with me. And I relied on stories, the little stories I had. A couple of maps and a lot of spirits. And so this picture actually before you is the Bodcaw Creek in between Canfield and Stamps, Arkansas, which we know Stamps from Maya Angelou, where she also experienced grief and trauma while living with her grandparents. This creek, from the stories that I've heard from my Nana Susie, I think the Bodcaw Creek is where she was baptized. So not just grief in the space, but thinking about spirituality, thinking about a rebirth, if you believe in that, around baptism. I found the Bodcaw Creek, right? And even if that is not the right creek where Nana Susie was baptized, even if that's a myth or a tall tale, being there did something to my spirit. Again, thinking from the continuum or the evolving, complicated nuance of grief and wellness. Breath of life. My baby girl left after birthing a baby, left bloody, left breathless, left her baby girl on my doorstep, left 4 more youngins, left Louisiana, thought I was done, but now I got someone to write my first name, carry my cotton sack, ring my chicken neck, sell my moonshine, tie my Oxford shoes, braid my plaits thick, sing my hymnal book. My baby girl left, her baby girl ready, pastor dip her down in the Bodcaw Creek. She catch the Holy Ghost soon as she catch her breath. So my Nana Susie was actually born Dottie Sue. But when she went to go live with her grandmother, who was named Susie, she changed her name to Susie. Finding my way. This poem is a golden shovel. That form was created by the poet Terrence Hayes in homage to Gwendolyn Brooks, so we can say that Gwendolyn Brooks also co-created the form. And the golden shovel uses words from Gwendolyn in the body of the new created poem. Typically, words from a line from Gwendolyn Brooks become the last words in the line of the new poem. So this line is from Gwendolyn's poem, My Grandmother is Waiting for Me to Come Home. How more apropos. The line reads, she is warm, wide, and long. She laughs, and she lingers. Finding my way. I go back to her birthplace. She left there long ago, left us long ago. She is from winding red clay roads and warm greetings, and who your people is, and wide porches, and I wander, look for clues, I long, and I wonder about her mother, and her mother, and her mother, and who my people is. She is unmappable, was unflappable. Her laughs still visit me, and I listen, think, she magic. Hope, hope lingers. Actually, some of those poems about my journey back to Canfield are in an article in the philosophy journal, Hepatia. I'm not a philosopher, but the journal had a special issue that was actually co-guest edited by Michigan State's own Dr. Kenitra Brooks, as well as Dr. Lakeisha Simmons and Dr. Camila Martin. And in that special issue, they invited articles or papers around conjure feminisms. So the Black feminist practice of conjure, whether that is deeply steeped in spirituality or religion, or the other ways that manifestations happen. And so I'm unpacking my journey back to Canfield, my communing with the earth and the rivers and the dirt roads, the clay roads and the trees and these memories and these rememories and the spirits in a sort of conjure and doing, again, this lineage work. So you can find more in that paper. So spring into wellness. Again, like I said at the beginning, we're not leaving grief over here and then suddenly we're well. It's evolving. They're in conversation. Like I said, they're cousins. But I do, with this invitation of this year's Science of Grief, to think about spending more time around wellness. What else is there in addition to grief, in conversation with grief, maybe on the other side, maybe today and not tomorrow, this concept of wellness. Like with grief, falling into grief, I talked about the melt. Spring into wellness, I want to think about a bounce. right? With this image before you, I have another one of my dance teachers, one of my earliest dance teachers, Lula Washington. When I was a little kid in LA, she ran what was then called the LA Contemporary Dance Theater in South Central LA. Now it's called the Lula Washington Contemporary Dance Foundation. And with this picture, she's kind of springy. She's kind of bouncing. But again, I want us to complicate wellness. It's not, again, I'm well, everything's great. For those of you that have seen Encanto, I have a little one. I'll talk about that a little later. So I'm watching a lot of Encanto. And I can't even blame it on her. I think I'm watching it more for me. But when I saw Lula Washington's picture, it also reminds me of Louisa, her embodiment in the film, how she was carrying the boulders atop her shoulders. But also when we get to the end of the film, it's the same kind of embodiment and movement when she's invited to lay on the hammock, laying back on the hammock, resting, getting her beverage, springing, bouncing. So I didn't plan this, but again, universe. I want to bring Toni Kambara into this room. One of the main and first people I go to when I want to learn about wellness, one of the experts. Today, she would have been 83 years old. So definitely looking towards Black women writers, to Black feminists, to our ancestors as knowledge producers. So in the novel, The Salt Eaters, in the very beginning of the novel, we have Minnie Ransom, who's a healer, asking a question, being in conversation with Velma Henry, who had attempted to complete suicide. And in the very first line of the book, this quote that is often shared, but the fullness is not always shared with it, the beginning quote, "Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well?" There's lots of memes of that going around social media. But I think it's important to flip a couple pages in the book where Minnie continues her question or continues her charge. She says to Velma, "Just so you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you're well." So that's where I start with this conversation of wholeness, of wellness and wholeness. Again, I started my conversation with grief with saying, as a public health practitioner and scholar, I wasn't trained in grief work or even in grief scholarship. I had to go to other spaces to learn that. I would beg to say sometimes in public health, we're not even trained around wellness because there's a lot of attention to death and disease and illness and risk and the at-risk. So for thinking of, I'm going to just share some working definitions today or tonight for our conversation around wellness. I want us to move beyond illness, beyond disease, beyond risk. Again, I'm not saying that those things don't exist. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Illness, disease, death are real. Risk is real. However, it's important to not leave the conversation there. Many did not leave the conversation with just asking, do you want to be well? There's another side. There's some more conversations. There's some more questions. So from Kambara, but other healers, scholars, practitioners, everyday folk who are contending with grief and therapy and wellness and healing and health, I've learned that wellness, or at least this working definition, is an active pursuit of one's individual and collective needs and desires. We heard that, as Natasha was sharing from her book, this event, Science of Grief, started with an active pursuit of her individual needs and desires, but it also was related to her collective. She talked about, I had many people to reach out to, right? And so I think it's important to think about the individual and the collective when we think about grief and when we think about wellness. In the Salt Eaters, it's again talking about desire. Do you want to be well? Just so you're sure. So again, it's going towards something. It's a choice to move. And then health and wellness are holistic, and so it's important to attend to just not the physical, but the mental, the emotional, we can say the social, the cognitive, and the spiritual sense of safety. I shared a minute ago thinking about safe spaces. I often say that there's no safe spaces, but I do work to actively create safer spaces for those in community with me. And a lot of folks that are talking about wellness, working towards wellness, practicing wellness, teaching about wellness recently are actually coming up with different metrics, such as tenderness, love, joy, hope. And these metrics are important. So if you think about mental health or mental illness, there's different tests and assessments that are given by practitioners to people, and depending on your score, you have a certain diagnosis. What if there were also assessments and metrics to measure or ascertain your level of joy, your level of hopefulness, your practices of love, your feelings of tenderness? We don't even say that word tender enough, right? What if those metrics existed in the health and healing professions as much as the metrics around risk, around illness? So that's what I've been contending with for the last few years, but especially with this invitation at MSU to think about wellness even more in arts, in scholarship, in humanities. So how did I learn about wellness? Again, not necessarily learned in a textbook or in an academic institution first. My first attention to wellness was again in South Central LA, and in the spaces co-curated by my family members. And so by art, by centering of Black girls and Black women, Black girl protagonists in books like Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Black girls in movies, even if they're not named or credited, who are demanding space, Black girls that form sisterhoods, that form squad, that play hand games and sing songs and keep a rhythm to their sisterhood. That's what has taught me first about wellness. Being 7. Mrs. Parker tells us to write a story. My paper, borrowed. My pencil, magical. My eraser, becoming a nub. I must get it right. Rewrite. What is right? Just right. Right? I get to be a flower girl. But girl, don't bloom so much. Learn to water my own soil, toss my petals, then run and collect them and repeat. Braids and beads for the first time, click, clacking me a rhythm, weaving and cleaving myself to something much bigger. Foil on the ends, shine, shine, shine. One Nana buys me luggage. One Nana buys me a plane ticket and sits real close to me. We soar, we land in her hometown, the hometown we do go back to. I wonder if this still feels like home. Home is hot. Home is always a Cadillac. Home is butter on biscuits, more cousins than I can remember. My beads and braids, too much for them. Give them a press and curl any old day. Braids be home. Home is mama. Right home. From this home. My pencil still be magical. My pencil always takes me home. I've also learned about wellness from my students and my research participants, narrators, interlocutors in community when I've asked about safety and resilience and violence, most of them Black girls and women. So I'm calling this a Black girl wellness. I've written about it. I'm trying to create a canon so that others can find them, find me, find us. My testimony is, when I teach, I awaken. When I teach, I represent. When I teach, I remember myself back to myself. I won't stop this. Even out of the classroom, out of the school, out of the academy. My words demand that you remember me, remembering us. So speaking of the young women that I've been in community with around research studies, around research questions, I spent the 8 years prior to coming to Michigan in Brooklyn. And in community, 4 of those 8 years were in community with a group of Black girls, African American, West Indian African girls from Central Brooklyn. So shout out to East Flatbush and Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy and Flatbush. And they taught me a lot about wellness. Again, something that was not typically asked of Black girls. Typically, the scholarship that is on the shelves when written about Black girls is not written by Black girls or for Black girls. It doesn't tell the full story. And so my attempt of sharing academic scholarship, poetry, thinking about movement, thinking about breathing with Black girls, for Black girls, always a Black girl, is again this attention to this is wellness. We are well, they are here. So one quote, I'm an ethnographer again, I mentioned, and so stories, narrative are important. So one of my narrators, she called herself Jay for the purposes of anonymity in research. She gave herself a name for others to learn about her. I was in conversation with her when she was 19. So she was actually a year away from high school, a year away from the program at the school where I met her. But she was reflective about her girlhood, about her experiences with violence, about her practices of wellness. And so in that reflection, she shares, and then coming to CAVI, which was the program that she was in, that was the first time that I cried. It was just like I finally got release and be comfortable. They were actually really supportive. And so she's talking about the importance of not just the facilitators, the Black women facilitators and staff and volunteers that she looked to as role models that held space, again, safer space for her, but she also was talking about her peers of other Black girls that found a safe space in maybe not so safe a school, maybe a school that didn't see their brilliance. They were in the program because they were thought to be too much. You're too loud in class, you don't even show up to class, you fight in the hallway, you're at risk, literally was the diagnosis. But in this 1 hour, once a week intervention, they had some space to cry. And if we think about Black girls and Black girlhood, we aren't always given space to cry. We don't even give ourselves space to cry. As young girls, toughen up, don't be soft, don't be a punk, hold it together, hold it down for everyone. And Jay is revealing that she did have some spaces to cry. Even if after that hour intervention on Thursdays at her school she couldn't, she could there. In my process of research, I often invite the young people back to the research space, so I'm not just interviewing them and then peace, see you later. I invite them back to co-analyze what is their data with me, and I use poetic techniques to analyze the data. And so after I interviewed Jay and her peers, I shared that data with the current group of girls in the program. So they were able to read and reflect back. And Nitty, a 15-year-old at the time, reflected or responded back in the form of a poem or a letter or a love letter to Jay. She didn't necessarily know her. Maybe they were from the same hood. They went to the same school, but at different years. But she still saw her. She still saw Jay. Dear Jay, you know the worth of yourself. Don't let nobody bring you down because you are good enough. So I want to let us think about the worthiness, the being good enough. And so I want to lead you into a short meditative practice, guided meditation with me as a guide, guided visualization. If you feel comfortable, those of you in the room, in this space with me, those of you live streaming, I would invite you to close your eyes, or at least cast your gaze downward. Get comfortable, whatever that means for you, for those in the space with me. Hard chairs, I know, but try to get comfortable, whatever that means for you. For those of you live streaming, you might be able to lay on your couch or lay on your bed. You can do that. I give you that invitation. Close your eyes and just breathe at your normal pace and rhythm. I call this getting refamiliar with our breath. Sometimes if we are not consciously either in crisis or in a meditation space, we're not always thinking about our breath. I talked about that with public health, right? Sometimes we don't know what's happening because it's working. So our breath has been there for us. It keeps us going. It's there. Let's give it some attention right now. So just breathe, normal pace and rhythm. Give a little bit of more noticing and attention to your breath. Now I'm going to invite you to take a bit deeper breath. If you want to, you might put one hand over your heart, maybe the other hand over your belly, thinking about our center, holding, hugging ourselves, our heart that keeps us ticking, our belly where we have nourishment, where we are sustained. So as you take deeper breaths, imagine your hands, your chest, and your belly expanding away from you. Hold that breath, and then as you exhale, your hands, your belly, your chest are coming back to you. So continue with that deeper breath, that deeper pace, that deeper rhythm. With your exhale, I invite you to part your lips and audibly exhale. It is Friday, TGIF. Let go what does not serve you. Release what you do not need. Release what is not yours to carry. Sit on your hammock. Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Minnie. Thank you, Toni. Thank you, Nana Susie. I want you, as you continue to breathe deeply, to perhaps think about a younger version of yourself. It may not be joyful. There might be some tenderness, but I want you to meet and greet your younger self. Say hello. And whatever you call that younger self, and I'm thinking younger before the age of 17. So you can think about your 3-year-old self, your 12-year-old self, your 14-year-old self, someone that you want to meet with your breath right now. Say hello, greet them, maybe it's a hug, a kiss, a dap, a head nod, call their name. And then begin a conversation with them in your mind, but also in your breath. What did you think about at that age? What were you concerned about, fascinated about? What were you worried about? What did you want to run home and do? What did you want to run away from? Send your breath there. I want to bring my mother's 3-year-old self into the room because I already shared about some grief that she experienced and witnessed. I want to share her own practices at 3, but also as what she calls a junior senior self now, and the conversation that she has, her current self and her younger self, that attends to wellness, to joy, to movement. Continue your breath while you hold my words, but also hold your own words with your breath, with your core. Mama has dance parties with her 3-year-old self. Sounds like there is a party in the background, because there is. Usually 3,000 miles between us, but tonight feels like just a living room. She say, it might be Curtis Mayfield 1 minute, breathe. Then Jaheim the next. Ghetto crooners. The ghetto, always her home, always has a song. She speaks in first person plural. We groovin', that's our jam. Breathe. Her dance partner is a 3-year-old middle child, big-eyed and chocolate brown. Her first words were cuss words. Heard her parents screaming them, learned how to open the closet sliding door and how to hide in between brohams and pocketbooks. Breathe. Years later, inherited that closet, pocketbook full of black and white photos, cuss words, inherited a mortgage and panic attacks. Breathe. The 3-year-old taught the grown-up to cock her head to the side and smile for the camera. Big-eyed and chocolate brown, to groove to ghetto crooners, to find a song. I want you to thank your younger self that you've been in communication with, that you've been in a breath practice with. Bid them adieu for this time. Again, maybe a hug, a kiss, a dap, a head nod. Tell them you'll see them soon when you need to commune, when you need to engage in these wellness practices. Return from the deep breathing, the deep visualization to your normal breath and rhythm. And when you're open, when you're ready and open to this process, wiggle your fingers and toes, get some blood circulating. And when you're ready, and only when you're ready, you can flutter your eyes open if they were closed. And coming back into this physical space in East Lansing, or this virtual space. Thank you for practicing that with me. You created a story. You created a poem. Again, we began it with, you are good enough. Nitty was telling Jay, can you tell your younger self, you are worthy, you are good enough? If you want to, maybe jot down some of those nuggets from your visualization so that you can keep that, as a tool or a technology of wellness. How we started this program, we're building these technologies for ourselves and for our communities. And so it's important to think, when we think about deliverables or outcomes, as we talk about in the research space or even in the artistic practice spaces, to think about some of these tools and technologies as our outcomes of wellness. The poems that we created, the side eyes that you might give someone, the hashtags that we do on social media, the laughter, the tears that you might have even emoted in this space, the deep breathing practices that we just did, the dancing that I've kind of talked about or alluded to throughout this presentation, those are practices of wellness. That's data. That's rigorous scholarship. That's rigorous art making. Those are outcomes as well as processes. some of my citations so you can continue to hashtag cite Black women, but also learn about my own practices of wellness, but also how I document other folks engaging in wellness practices. And I want us to end this conversation with a bit of joy. So I started with my own kind of sharing of my grief process around becoming or trying to become a mother. That was able to be realized in March of 2020. This picture is May 2020, so 2 years ago. She does not look like that now. It's almost her bedtime. She may or may not be on the live stream, because sometimes when she live streams, she thinks that Mama is right there instead of down the road. Her name is literally Worthy. So with her name, not only will she remind herself, but whoever says her name, we have to engage in a wellness practice of articulating our own worth. So Worthy informed this poem that I'll leave you with. So think about 2020. So she was born 2 weeks before the lockdown. Think about everything that happened in the world after that, personally, professionally, globally. So one of her first scholarly acts was participating in webinars with her mama, right? So this is Worthy in these webinars. I think my baby knows how to work Zoom better than me. Real quiet when mommy's unmuted, stares at me like I have something important to say. Real loud when I go on mute. I have been telling her to amplify her voice. She listens. She responds. Must be time to nourish herself for the movement and all. Feeds under the camera's glare, then takes her rest. Wakes up just in time for me to sign off. Smiles for the camera if it's with folks I trust. Beckons me to stop sharing my video for folks that don't deserve to bask in all of our melanin. Black Lives Matter image be my profile picture now, summer 2020. Political education started in utero. So she allows me to tag and hashtag and share links and link up and LinkedIn. And who are all of these other babies with mamas that look like her mama? Searching for virtual tribes now that we've all gone virtual. Even our meditation has gone viral. She takes deep breaths in, deep breaths out with me. Seems to know that this balance is hard. The weight of it all, work in the world, and leave meeting mommy. Tomorrow is another day. Thank you. Thank you for engaging with me. Folks on the live stream, again, I can't see your questions. I can't see your claps and your snaps, but I feel them. Again, feel free to reach out to me, email, social media. For folks in the room, we might have a little bit of time. If folks have questions, no pressure. But I'm happy to engage in dialogue either on or off stage. Thank you for your time.
And if you do have questions afterwards, Dr. Dill left the information to be contacted on in the beginning of the conversation. And if you're open to it, people can possibly come up to you now. And I would not say ask the question. I would say just ask what the email address is and the contact information, because as a performer, there's almost nothing worse than it's like, I have no questions. And then you have your coat and your purse and you think you're about to head out. And then they're like, well, I have a question. And then the other person, like, I had a question too. I had a question too. And then you're just there for another hour. So just get the contact information. So we apologize if during the meditation session, maybe the cameraman actually was involved as well and the camera fell to the floor. Now, that's a trick statement because if you're on a live stream, your eyes should have been closed as well. But we do want to say thank you again to Dr. Dill. Give it up for that amazing presentation, that amazing conversation on wellness. Again, the Science of Grief is a 3-day festival that we have been blessed enough to bring to Michigan State University, and we are grateful for all of our partners. One thing that we realized almost at the end of planning the Science of Grief is that in this 3-day festival, every conversation and every workshop is actually facilitated by women. So last night, it was Lauren Russell and myself co-facilitating a workshop in partnership with the Broad Museum. And tonight we had our keynote speaker, Dr. Dill. And tomorrow, we have Bonnie Wheeler in partnership with Sundari, who will also be having a conversation on grief and wellness, and then ending with another meditation session. And thank you for your meditation session today. It is a Friday, and we are grateful for you spending your time here with us at WKR, at the Michigan State Museum, at involving yourself in the science of grief. We are not ever concerned about the amount of people who exist in the space, because we have all called in our ancestors in the space, and I'm sure that these seats were filled. And the way that we have programmed the Science of Grief in the past 4 years is that it's typically a silent audience. So we don't encourage people to clap. We don't encourage people to respond. We want people to actually sit with the feelings, to sit with their future selves and with their past selves. So again, we are not worried about who was and who wasn't here. WKR has done us the pleasure and the honor of creating a video post Science of Grief. So if you are an instructor, faculty, staff who is looking to show this video to colleagues or students of yours, feel free to get in contact with us at the Michigan State University Museum. So we would like to thank, again, all of our partners. We would like to thank Jennifer and WKR. You could put it together for Jennifer and WKR for helping us program this tonight. And again, the Michigan State Museum, all of my colleagues at the museum, Lauren Russell with the Poetry Center, the Broad Museum, and tomorrow Reimagine, that program. You are free to join as well. Just check us out at the museum website. I am Natasha T. Miller. Thank you to everybody who was behind the camera and who made this production a success tonight. If, again, you have any questions, there are different ways in which you can contact us. And I think if I had to end on one thing that came from the conversation today, it was the question of, do you want to be well? And I think that is something that we can all go forward asking ourselves, and also trying to not analyze other people, but ask the same question of, does this person want to be well? I remember in the first few months of my grief, I was forcing wellness on myself, and I did not want to be well. And it probably caused me a lot more trauma and grief than it would have if I would have actually accepted that that was not the space that I was in at the moment. And I have now stepped into spaces with other people who I want to be well, but they don't want to be well. And it traumatizes me all over again. So I think if that is the question of the evening, it is one that is worthy of being answered, and it is, do you want to be well? So we want to make sure that you all are taken care of. We will, if you want to, reach out to us to find resources on campus, again, outside of campus. If anyone felt any sort of triggers tonight, we want to make sure that we provide you with the number to the suicide hotline, which is 1-800-273-8255. Again, that number is 1-800-273-8255. We know the grief can be heavy. It can be triggering. In the meantime, take care of yourself and take care of your mental health. I am Natasha T. Miller, and thank you for being here.